Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Coast to Coast Combat Hour. I'm your host, Matthew Hawkins, along with my co host, Ed Carbajal. And on a weekly basis, we plan to bring you the biggest news and interviews in the world of combat sports. Ed, how you doing?
Pretty good. Pretty good. It's been nice weather, so can't complain.
Hot out there?
Hot enough to make a snake drop out on my doorstep today. So, which is a rarity in New Jersey. So, I'm pretty sure some hawk like dropped it flying by or something.
Yeah, it was 115 at my house last weekend. Luckily, I was in Vegas for the fights, where it was actually cooler in Vegas than at my house, which is pretty unheard of.
Mm.
But I want to jump right to our guest. Somebody who's been supportive of the show since day one, and a person I met on the road while traveling for fights, actually in your neck of the woods in New York. Um, Jon Lucas. John, how you doing?
Good, thanks.
Must be that jujitsu on my mind. I got John Lewis thinking in my
Yeah.
head, but thanks for joining us. You've been a martial artist I know for almost 2 decades now. Um, how did you get started in that?
So, like a lot of people, when I was in elementary school and high school, was, kind of interested in karate. That was in the 70s, 80s, early 90s. And, was into all the karate movies. And then, Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal when they came out, and always wanted to train. But I lived in a fairly small town and lived a ways out of town. So there just wasn't really any access to the martial arts except for the occasional friend who trained who'd kind of, do the, hey, grab my wrist, let me show you this cool move sort of thing. So I was always interested. And then when I went to college, I met a guy who had trained some ninjutsu when he was in high school. So he and I would kind of, move furniture out of the common area in the dorm and, kind of sort of half spar and, do sort of spazzy white belt sort of stuff. And after kind of doing that for a while, we found out there was a place around the corner where they had a sensei who had a little school that did Aiki jiu-jitsu. He called it. He had done Aikido and kind of split from the Aikido, I don't know what you call it, association, and started off doing what he called Aikido Jiu-Jitsu. So we decided we'd join up and train there. So I trained there for a couple of years. And then when I went to medical school, there was a formal Aikido school not too far away. So I did Aikido through medical school. And then once I moved down to South Carolina for residency and fellowship, my free time was pretty sparse. I wasn't able to train, but I always thought if I ever found a place where I could train jiu-jitsu, I wanted to do that because while I was doing Aikido, like a lot of folks, eventually VCR tape of, I think I saw UFC 2 first. And then after enjoying that, found UFC 1 and 3 and saw Hoist Gracie doing his thing. I was like, wow, this stuff's awesome. He's about my size and he's beating up on all these bigger dudes. I want to learn how to do that someday. So eventually when I moved to the upstate of South Carolina, my son was getting old enough to start in karate as a kid. And then my wife had heard from a bunch of people about the Thompson's place, upstate karate in Pitch Black. So started training him there, and they had a sign in the window saying that they did Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So I asked about it, and they're like, yeah, we've got a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu program, which actually at the time was only partially true. They had one. Their instructor had just left, but I joined just after the instructor they used to have walked out the door and wound up doing kickboxing and MMA for a couple of years before we got somebody else trained up to start doing jiu-jitsu. And then when they restarted the jiu-jitsu program, I was there in the first night and have been training for the 8.5 years since. And it was worth the wait.
Yeah, you mentioned you were going to college. We'll get into that here shortly about how you became a doctor and eventually start working as a ringside physician for several kickboxing and martial arts events. But want to stick with the martial arts aspect of your history a little bit. So you saw UFC 2. So after you saw Scott Morris, the first ninjutsu guy ever in UFC, get crushed by Pat Smith, you must have felt a little bit of redemption seeing Steve Jenham come back in UFC 3 and bring home the title as an alternate.
Yeah, by the time I got exposed to ninjutsu, it was that was probably in 93, 94. It was kind of already the time where ninjutsu was sort of falling out of favor and Aikido was kind of the thing. So when we walked into the Aikido Jiu-Jitsu program, and the guy, Chris, that had been the guy who kind of introduced me to ninjutsu, his thing was, well, you've seen what Steven Seagal does. So that's kind of the answer to the stuff that we kind of learned in jiu-jitsu. So I was never really a big ninjutsu aficionado, but it sure looked cool. The idea of becoming a ninja and being able to do, mind control and disappearing into a puff of smoke, running across water would be
Yeah, you
awesome.
could blame
Sadly,
Shokazuki in the 80s for that.
never got to that point. Still can't run across water and haven't been able to disappear into a puff of smoke, but maybe someday.
Well, different puffs of smoke now with the legalization of marijuana. But let me ask you, Jon, just because of your martial arts experience and obviously you're a doctor too, and I know you do ringside physician. You get licensed for that? Do you do that in certain states?
Yeah, so medical licensing, just like a licensing to practice law, is by state. So the only license I maintain is in South Carolina. It's actually fairly expensive to get licensed in a new state. It would probably cost me somewhere in the neighborhood of $2,000 to $5,000 to get a license for North Carolina, Georgia, or Tennessee. The immediate surrounding states to me. So I do all the ringside stuff just in South Carolina.
Is it so just because of everything going on? I mean, it's interesting that Matt found you to get on this week after we took off last week. Obviously, with all the stuff that happened or that's been happening in the sport, and like with the UFC, just overall, like as somebody that's got your level of expertise and everything you've been seeing, what's your take on weight cutting and everything that's been going on, the Max Holloway situation? Like, how do you feel about? Do you think more weight classes are better? Should they listen to what the fighters want? What's your take on all of that?
Yeah, so weight cutting is kind of the torch that I'm most ambitious about bearing. I don't know if you've seen some of the stuff that I've posted on the MMA community and some other places about that, but I actually sit on the ABC medical committee. So have been part of some of the talks about, you've probably heard of Andy Foster, who's the executive director out in California. He came up with that 10-point plan that CSAC now has in place. And when that was first brought up through the medical committee, I thought for sure that by this time that would have been passed in pretty much every state, certainly in Nevada and New Jersey, and that the whole weight cutting thing would be on its way out. And I've been very depressed that that's not been the way that it's happened. So I'm definitely not a big fan of weight cutting. I think that it's sort of odd how we got to where we are, because if we could snap our fingers and make weight cutting go away, you just kind of everybody not realize that was possible. With very few exceptions, the same guys would be fighting each other, just up a weight class or two. The guys that are welterweight, they'll walk around somewhere between about 195 and 205.
Yeah.
So those guys that all be, light heavyweights or, maybe middleweights, and you'd be seeing better fights because the guys wouldn't be dehydrating themselves to the point that they're, in some cases, if you walked into the ER just as an average guy who'd been out in the heat, as dehydrated as most are, when they weigh in, you'd get admitted to the hospital and be there for 24 to 36 hours, get rehydrated, make sure electrolytes okay, and then, be cleared to leave the hospital. And these guys are doing that to themselves. And then 24 hours later, having a fight against a world-class fighter. It's extremely dangerous. And I would have also thought that once we had a fighter die, that there'd be a huge outcry, but that's happened now multiple times. And it just kind of gets blown off. Everyone's like, oh, yeah, well, he died. Well, he knew he was getting into, and they're on to the next thing. I don't know if that's because it's typically been fighters that are lesser known, or they're not American and they're not, known by anybody who's not a super hardcore fan. But I'm hoping that we can get something put in place so that we can get these fights to happen and keep fighters safe before there's a big death or significant injury on a grand scale. If one of the, like Conor McGregor or a big time UFC fighter who's more of a household name ends up getting hospitalized because of a weight cut or dies because of complications of cutting weight, I think that's going to be devastating to the sport, and it'll be too late to change things. It'll be suddenly a huge outcry from people who may not be that big fans, and you may see licensing for MMA start disappearing from states instead of trying to do something to get rid of weight cutting.
Yeah, especially here in New York, where it's only been since 2016 they lifted the ban on it. So that's actually a big concern too. I think that's why some people say that New York's a little bit too weird with the way they're handling things, but I think that's the reason why. They had that boxer that suffered the head trauma. That's like I forget his name. Because the whole situation was handled bad. He had to take a cab to the hospital or something like that. I know Access Inside MMA did a whole expose on it back when they were still on the air. But so yeah, I think if something like that does happen, like you said, to a big name fighter in the UFC, it's definitely a problem. The death you're referring to, that's the ONE FC, the guy that fought and I won, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
There
Who
was a guy in I think Jungle Fight or one of the Brazilian events
That's
died as well.
exactly.
A guy from I think he was Nova União, Andre Pederneiras' school, I think. I think he's the guy who died. And then didn't somebody? I mean, I don't know if it was after the fight, but somebody Conor McGregor's one of his guys was fighting. I think somewhere in Europe died too. I don't know if that was related to a weight cut or
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
an injury, but so what do you? I mean, right now the solutions you've talked about that have been brought up. Do you think that adding more weight classes and stuff like that it would help at all? I've always argued that someone's just going to see the next weight class is only 5 pounds away, and it's just going to be a reason for that person to push it a little farther.
Yeah, and exactly. And I think you're exactly right about making little itty bitty step changes, and I think that's the issue that we've had, like with the UFC moving weigh-ins to the morning and Dana White making that statement that he thinks that's more dangerous or a problem, and they're moving it back to the afternoon. The beauty of the 10-point plan that Andy Foster came up with is that instead of making little steps that each individual thing may have unintended consequences, I think they need to make a whole bunch of wholesale changes at the same time to prevent people from saying, oh, well, now I can cut, just a little bit more and be a whole weight class lighter. So I do think adding more weight classes is important. And I think that the weight classes that are mentioned in the 10-point plan, which are more or less every 10 pounds, with the exception of, in the pounds were on the 5. So it was 155, 165. And then because of pushback from both the UFC and Bellator for what they say are contractual reasons, they want to keep 170 and then have 175, 185, 195, 205, 225, 260. I think having more weight classes is important, but they also need to move towards doing both some sort of weight certification like they do for high school and NCAA wrestling, some sort of hydration testing to make sure that we know how much these guys are dehydrated when they're weighing in, so that we don't let people who are 10-15% dehydrated, crash, rehydrate over 12 hours and then get into a fight the next day. And I also think that doing weigh-ins either just before the event or just after the event to find out how much weight guys are putting back on to get an idea of what their real walk-around weight is important as well. Andy's done 2 studies. He did one in MMA and then just recently did one in boxers out in California. In something, I think in the boxing, which I always assumed that there was a little bit less weight cutting in boxing than was in MMA, just because of the events I've been to. I don't see the boxers looking quite as drawn out as a lot of the MMA fighters, and because there's so many more weight classes in boxing than there are in MMA. But they found that 20% of fighters were cutting more than 15% of their body weight, I think, based on what their weigh-in weight was versus their weight at the time of the event.
So, one of my arguments has always been I always it generally falls on the fighters, but I always try to bring it back to the promoters a little bit. For me, once a guy misses weight in a weight class, he should at that point he should be basically on alert where the promotion shouldn't sign that guy to fight in that weight class any longer. If a guy misses by 1 or 2 pounds, maybe you cut him some slack. But if a guy misses weight by 5-6 pounds, to me it should be an instant move up. You don't sign a contract with that fighter. If that guy dies making his next weight cut, I feel like the promotion should be held liable almost for I as a construction guy, if I told somebody to climb a ladder and I knew they had a broken leg and they fall, I'm going to jail for telling that person to climb the ladder. If somebody's had trouble cutting weight and I sign them to a contract to cut another 30 pounds of weight for their next fight, I think that should be something that should be changed too. Once somebody misses weight, I don't think maybe you give somebody a second chance, but I don't think there should be any third chances. After you miss the second time, you should have to fight in the weight class above that.
Yeah, and I think there should be some from a regulation standpoint. I think the athletic commissions need to make 2 specific changes about the way they handle weight cutting and people missing weight. The first is it's ludicrous to me that especially at the UFC and Bellator level that we let guys try to cut weight, so say somebody's trying to make welterweight and they weigh in, they're 173, and they say, okay, well, you get an hour, you can go try to cut 2 more pounds. That's absolutely crazy to me. I think you should get one chance at getting on the scale, because I mean, it's not like scales aren't available. No one, I find it hard to believe that anybody at that level has gotten on the scale and been surprised that they were over. They know darn well that they're having trouble making weight and their cut's not going well. And they're like, well, we'll go down, maybe we can find the magic spot in the scale, or, hold on to the towel a little bit, or lean on Dana or something like that to weigh in. But when they're heavy, they've been trying as hard as they can to make weight and they didn't make it. I don't think the commission should be able to extend their time. They should say, okay, you missed weight, you get a financial penalty for that. And also, moving forward, once you've missed weight, I think the next time that fighter fights, the commission should be much more careful about figuring out when they show up to the fight week. If they come in on Monday or Tuesday, weighing them and making sure they're within 10% of their weight, and probably checking them a couple of times along the way to make sure that they're not leaving themselves to cut 10, 11, 12 pounds of water weight in the past 12 hours. And then for sure, if you miss weight a second time, I don't feel comfortable relicensing that fighter to fight at that weight class, unless, they'd have to go up for at least a fight or two and then demonstrate at some point in the future that they've reduced their body mass to the point that is reasonable for them to make the next lower weight class again. Just like they do in high school wrestling.
So let me ask you, just to switch off a little bit, not really switch off of the weight class thing, but with your being a medical professional, the stuff that happened at 226 with Max Holloway's removal, did you see any of those interviews where they were citing his concussive symptoms?
So, I saw the interview with Bisping, where Bisping actually called him out, was like, hey, you look really tired. And I didn't watch that with an unbiased eye, because I had heard what happened before I got back from work and was able to go back and watch in the video, knowing the fight had already been canceled. But, when you see him, the way he looks and the way he's talking, he looks like he had either just woken up after a really hard night of drinking, or had, smoked the biggest joint you've ever seen. He was clearly out of it and wasn't talking like he normally talks, and just didn't seem like he was all there. It's not clear to me exactly what was causing that. It's, I think, somewhat ironically, you've heard that he was too dehydrated, which is fairly unlikely that far out from the fight. He shouldn't be cutting water weight yet. And then I saw recently some people have speculated that he had a stroke. It seems like if that were true, we would probably know about that, because they would have done some testing and been able to prove that and treated that appropriately. Or he was in the middle of water loading, which is what I think is most likely. He was probably doing the drinking deionized water thing and had screwed his electrolytes up enough, and he was having some problems because of that. All three of which, though, are very dangerous things that can happen to, during the weight cut, especially in people who are, and I'm not accusing Max of doing this, but especially guys who are doing other things like using hypobaric chambers to try to get their hematocrit up, or EPO or something like that. So they're running their hematocrits higher than they should be. And then they're also cutting weight. Your blood literally gets way too viscous, and it makes your risk of stroke extremely high. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, the guys that are doing the deionized water loads, trying to flush electrolytes out of your system, I've seen a number of people, or heard of a number of people, who have gotten themselves pretty disoriented because of doing that, because they screw their electrolytes up and they start having neurologic symptoms because of it, either during the part where they're flushing out with drinking 2 gallons of deionized water a day, or at the end of it where they go to drinking a gallon, half a gallon a day, a quarter of a gallon, and then nothing for 2 days while they're doing intense exercise, while you're dehydrating yourself so severely like that. It's very easy to get your electrolytes enough out of whack that you're in trouble. I mean, you guys go to the weigh-ins, you see what these guys look like. There's a lot of guys who, at the time of weigh-in, these are world-class professional fighters, but they look like a toddler could beat them up at that time, because they're having trouble standing upright, much less functioning as an athlete.
Would you say all the problems since they went to the early weigh-ins is probably more a result just the fighters not getting up early, not waking up at 3 a.m. to start their final cut? I always thought that might be an issue from day one, and I didn't understand why they didn't give the people the whole day basically to weigh in. Do you think that's what it is?
I think there's two possibilities, and they're not mutually exclusive. One, I think that, especially guys that have been doing this for a while are just used to the, 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the afternoon weigh-ins. So they're used to getting up at their usual 8, 9 o'clock and starting their weight cutting process, and they're not getting up earlier to weigh in the morning. I think that may be part of it, but I think more likely for a larger portion of the fighters, especially the guys that are, kind of known to being big in their weight class, is they think, well, I've got an extra, 4, 5, 6 hours to rehydrate, so I can cut an extra 2 or 3 pounds. So they're walking around a little bit heavier. So I think both of those things probably are contributing to that.
I know you've been around Chris Weidman a little bit, and I've always brought him up as one of the biggest middleweights that I've personally ever met.
He's a monster.
Do you know of him ever having any issues? I mean, I know he's never missed weight.
Yeah, so that's about to say, he's never missed weight. I've never actually been around him when he's doing a weight cut, but a lot of the guys I've trained with, and Steven and Ray Thompson in particular, have been around, and it's never been an issue. I've never heard of him having a bad cut, but he's a good example of someone. He's been cutting weight since he was a toddler, because he's been, from wrestling. So he's very used to it. He knows what kind of weight he has to be, but he is definitely, when I first met him face to face, it is amazing to me that he is as big as he is. And then you look at somebody like Yoel Romero, looks like he's twice his size, and got so much more muscle mass. It still makes the same weight. I don't understand how that's physically possible.
Yeah, no, I've been to a lot of things at Weidman. I actually trained with someone that trained with that got the black belt around the same time Weidman got his, and I mean, like you said, having seen him physically, like it was at the first time Aldo and Holloway fought for the belt. They did a virtual thing here in New York. So he was like a guest at it to get the fans riled up, and I was walking as media. I was in the same area as him, so I got to stand right behind him, and I was just like, "How is this guy fight at 185? He's a monster." And the same thing with Yoel Romero. When he was walking around, he was in the crowd at the weigh-ins for the last 217, and there was no way you missed him in the crowd, because there was this just giant of a man walking around looking at his cell phone, and you could tell from far away that's Yoel Romero. I'm glad he's actually going up to 205, because I feel like at his age, I mean, there's got to be some truth to look at us. I mean, I don't know how old you are. I'm up there, and I'd like to be 185, and I'm lucky if I get close to 190.
Yeah, that's it, both at UFC events and especially when I go to the local events here. So, you're right with the fighters and doing their physicals and things like that. I walk around about 180 pounds. When I compete in jiu-jitsu, like for the IBJJF, I compete at middleweight, which is up to 181.5. So I'll diet down and lose 2 or 3 pounds to make sure that I don't go overweight with the gi. But when we're at these fights, I see guys that are, fighting at 145 and in some cases 135 that are bigger than I am, significantly bigger than I am, when they're just kind of walking around, and they pop into the gym to roll, and I'm like, you look familiar, but I'm like, oh, it's because you've actually got your normal weight on. It's amazing how big some of these guys are for their weight class.
Yeah, well, that's having met you and then having met like somebody like Max Holloway, and I mean, he's basically your size. I mean, he might be a little bit smaller, but not much. I don't remember exactly when I saw him. It was shortly after one of his fights, because he had his broken hand. He was casted up, but yeah, I mean, he's one of those guys that it seems like he's like upper 170s, 180, and he's cutting down to 145. I mean, I can't even comprehend the idea of trying to lose, 25 pounds or 25% of your body weight.
The one last thing on Max Holloway I just wanted to comment on, because I was actually talking about that. I was visiting with my dad before we started, and we were talking about Max Holloway. I think Max Holloway's issue, because and you'd have to help me out here on this, Matt, with Max Holloway. So they pulled him out of 226 because they didn't like the way he looked on the treadmill when he was cutting. Obviously, we know why they pulled. I'm sorry, 223. 226 was the recent one. And then before that, didn't he have like an arm injury or something? Like, is that the same injury you're talking about? Like his arm was broken or something?
He had a supposed, I think, leg or knee injury for 222, and then he quickly turned around and accepted the fight with Khabib. After he told, that's why Edgar took the fight with Ortega.
So I'm wondering if he's just training too old school, like Team Quest, the back of the car lot or whatever. You know what I mean? Like just too rough. I'm wondering if he's just in Hawaii. Maybe they still go too hard at training, because if he has a concussion, if he's hurting himself in training, I know no fighter is without injury, but there's they brought in the UFC Performance Institute for a reason.
Yeah, well, I mean, my alert would have been sent up when I realized that he took the Khabib fight on a week's notice, give or take a day, but it was the weight class heavier than what he fights at. It was at lightweight. So when he can't make lightweight even on a week's notice, to me that should throw up a flag and go, this guy should never be cutting down to 145. And that might
Mhm.
have had nothing to do with his recent issue. Maybe it was a concussion, maybe it was something else. But if you can't make the weight class above you on a few days' notice, to me, you shouldn't be cutting that extra 10 pounds ever. I mean, that to me, that's insane.
So,
Yeah,
John, I just wanted to ask you, what's your take on training smart versus training hard? Especially like you said, you're a four-stripe purple belt in jiu-jitsu. Being a medical professional, I'm pretty sure a lot of guys come to you in the changing room like, "Hey, dude, I think I blew out my knee. Can you check it out?" Like, being in that position as you yourself, someone that's rolling and training with guys, do you ever feel like you got to pull a blue belt or a white belt 20-year-old guy aside and say, "Hey, how about you slow down a little bit and not try to kill yourself and everyone on the mats?"
yeah. So there's a difference in my eyes from doing that in jiu-jitsu versus doing that when you're getting hit in the head, because the difference between a brain injury and an injury to a joint or something like that, the long-term significance of that is very different.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny because I'm always advocating people sparring smart and trying to stay fast but light to the head, and not doing a whole lot of hard sparring, making sure that if you get your bell rung, quote unquote, you take adequate time off. But jiu-jitsu wise, I'm the guy that, like literally last week, I dislocated one of my fingers in the middle of a roll, was able to reach up, put it back in joint, and just went right back to, didn't even say anything about it. And I roll when I'm kind of hurt all the time. It's hard, I think, to have that conversation with folks, especially somebody who's got a colored belt of some sort, to tell them that they're being a little too aggro. I've had that chat with some white belts before saying, hey, you're not going to ever get better unless you kind of calm down and start trying to use technique. But especially as one of the older guys on the mat, I often worry that hey, you need to kind of settle down comes across as, oh, this old guy can't keep up, so he's telling me to sort of settle down. I definitely do think that training smart is the way to go, but it's hard to get that point across sometimes.
Have you ever heard the quote from Helio where he said, "I'd like to cook him a little bit"?
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean that's pretty much the old guy's game. I mean, and it works. I mean, not for nothing. I roll with a lot of competitive younger dudes, and I letting them go crazy on me for the first half of the round is usually how I wind up getting the advantage later. And I think for me that's the equivalent of training smart when you're grappling. But like you said, I know when striking comes into the fold, it's a different ball game, because even if you're trying to control shots to the head, when you're going like hard to the body, light to the head, like I used to do when I did Ishin Ru karate, it was hard shots to the body and light contact to the head. But somebody always walked into something. I myself walked into a lot of things that I lost some time for a little bit. So it's definitely hard to control it when adrenaline jumps in and blood gets going. So I don't know. The other thing about the looking at people while they're cutting as somebody that's licensed. So I'm thinking about what was that chick's name that they pulled for because they didn't like the way her lips look, Matt, not that long ago.
Jessica Aguilar.
Yeah. Did you write anything about that or have an opinion on just pulling people based on appearance?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's perfectly appropriate, and I think that's sort of the getting back to Max a little bit. That's the scariest thing about that situation is if he hadn't had that interview, and Michael Bisping, and kudos to him for calling him out on live TV, because especially given who his employer is, that there's definitely a risk to
Yeah.
having pulled the co-main event off the air basically by saying that. But if Max hadn't had that interview, there's a good chance he would have continued with his weight cut. He might have made weight and gone and fought. So I think that when you hear that somebody got pulled because of how they look, and you see the way that people look that don't get pulled, there must have been a serious issue going on.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably very, very appropriate.
Well, I had heard that he was rushed to the hospital on Monday. I think we kind of heard about his news about Wednesday or so.
Yeah.
Um, you know, if a guy gets rushed to the hospital on fight week, I think there needs to be serious thought about letting that guy go out and do, he did the public workout, anything other than maybe just sitting back and relaxing. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how often people get rushed to the hospital on fight week, but even as a fan who buys tickets and gets disgusted when fights get canceled, I don't want to see somebody die in there because the UFC is trying to, or I shouldn't just say the UFC, any promotion is trying to push somebody in to keep a fight card intact.
Yeah, no, and we definitely don't want to see it a fighter because they have that fighting spirit, quote unquote, the warrior spirit or whatever it is. Because obviously Max was ready to go until he got pulled. He didn't pull himself. So I just feel like, I mean, it's cool and on one end, but obviously you want to see him fight again or at least retire healthy.
John, we in the past on some of our other shows, I think with Johnny Hughes, we may have talked about some injuries we've seen over the years, or I think some of the ones were maybe ones that he had actually inflicted on opponents. But as a ringside physician, have you ever ran into anything catastrophic, or have you been lucky enough to kind of avoid those events?
No, I mean, catastrophic. I've seen some people get some pretty significant injuries. So the first and probably the most impressive was I saw a guy get a tib fib fracture from a blocked checked kick, just a la Corey Hill or Anderson Silva, which was, and the guy was a Army Ranger. He was actually active duty at the time and was fighting out of one of the camps that's near one of the local Army bases, and he had an impressively little reaction to that. He, threw the kick, his leg broke. Everybody in the arena heard it and saw it, and his legs, kind of dangling there. And he hopped on it a couple of times, and his opponent stopped. Thank God. He realized that something was not right, and he had this look on his face like he was trying to figure out how he could put his foot down to throw another strike, and then realized and just sat down. But it was very impressive. But fortunately for him, there's really no long-term consequence from that. Lots of cuts and stuff like that. Some people have dislocated their shoulders. I actually saw a guy who dislocated his shoulder and relocated it himself in the middle of the fight and then got mad at me for stopping it between rounds and not letting him continue. It was in an amateur boxing fight of all things. So, totally from a, lifetime or financial standpoint, it's no impact to his career at all. But fortunately, I've not seen anybody get injured to the point where they had, a life-changing or long-term sustained injury. I thought I had a guy once who was going into something called rhabdomyolysis. If you really overexert yourself, especially if you're a little bit dehydrated, sometimes your muscles will start to break down and you start getting muscle proteins in your kidneys, and that can be a very, very serious thing. It was after a Muay Thai fight, and he was complaining about severe leg pain and wouldn't walk. And then, of course, that's when he says, I had rhabdo a couple years ago, which, of course, he made no comment about either on his pre-fight physical where he got cleared by his primary physician or when I saw him just before the fight. But a couple hours later, he was perfectly fine.
Wow.
Do you ever just because, like you said, I know you just said you stopped fights. You ever get any negative feedback from the fans, like you suck or any of that stuff when you wave one off?
There's been a couple people yell stuff. I get a pretty thick skin. I'm not there to be a fan favorite. I'm there to try to keep the fighters safe. The time I was actually most worried about that was actually the first event I ever worked. There's a guy, he's in the UFC now, Justin Scoggins, who at the time was training with us. He's a local guy and had a huge following. So, there was literally hundreds of people there to see him fight. In about probably 45 or so seconds into the fight, he does a lot of head movement, and he moved his head one way, and the guy he was fighting moved his head the other, and they just crashed heads, and he got a pretty impressive laceration over his eye. It was in a bad spot. It was deep. It was bleeding right into his eye. So I went into the ring and, put a towel on it for a second, took it off, and, could practically see his skull. And I'm like, dude, I hate to do this to you, but we got to stop. And he was kind of upset, but not mad at me. And as I was walking out of the cage, I thought to myself, well, I'm going to have to find another school to train at. As soon as this event is over, Ray's going to grab me, yell at me, and tell me, you ever do that again, I'm going to kill you. But he was, totally cool. That actually said thanks, because he was going to throw the towel in had I not, stopped that. So it was a little scary for a second for me, but it was a good experience because it kind of brought home the fact that it's not my job to be thinking about what the fans think about this. I don't care what the promoters think about that. If they want to say, hey, you stopped this fight too early, we're not going to use you anymore. That's their prerogative, but I don't want to accidentally let somebody get hurt that I could potentially have done something about. And I had a couple of years later had a female fighter who had a similar. She got caught. I think it was a legal strike. I think it was an elbow, but got caught with an elbow in a fight that she was winning and probably was going to win. But it was the same story. It was in a bad spot. It was bleeding right into her eye. And as soon as the referee stopped the fight, she immediately looked at me. And as I was walking in the cage, she was like, "Don't stop the fight! Don't stop the fight! Don't stop the fight!" But I walked over, I'm like, "Sorry, got to." And the same thing in retrospect, she was like, "I'm really glad you did that." But that's why I'm there. If the fighters were able to make good decisions about whether they should continue or not on their own, you wouldn't need to have a ringside physician or a ringside medic or a cut man.
Yeah.
Well, wow, this has been pretty informative as far as hearing about some of this stuff. We don't get a lot of this perspective anywhere really. I mean, you hear about some of the cut men and stuff, but to actually hear a doctor giving his perspective on stopping fights or his opinion on the weight cuts and stuff has been pretty cool. So I appreciate you coming on with this.
Yeah, we definitely might have to tap you again in the near future, because this was I mean, I could go longer myself, but like Matt said, I mean, this is very interesting. I mean, I'm surprised I've never interacted with you in the community. You said you post on the MMAcommunity.com forum, and
Yep.
where else?
That's pretty much it. I have an account over at the Underground, but I very rarely post there anymore. And if I do, it's usually in the BJJ sub forum.
You should do like a combat sports health blog. You know how there's like the combat sports law that Eric McCracken runs? You should do something like that. Just because obviously
there's actually. Go ahead.
I'm just saying there's you obviously have a lot of knowledge that I mean, you cleared some things up for me. So like the whole thing about looking at someone, I had a different opinion about it until you explained it. So now I perfectly understand why they would pull people off of treadmills or based on how their lips look and stuff like that. So you should look into doing something like that.
Yeah, I actually thought about that. In a couple of years ago, I wrote an article for Carrick on the Underground, and it's been sort of surprising to me that there's very, very little interest in that. The time that I get questions and stuff is usually after a specific episode, so like the Max Holloway thing. But as far as kind of general information and stuff, myself and a couple of other ringside physicians have tried starting something like that up, and it almost always falls apart. So I haven't really put too much effort into that. And Ringside Medicine is, sort of a hobby for me. It's not something I ever intend to make any money. I actually don't accept payment for doing it. I just do it on a pro bono basis. So most of the people who I've seen try to start blogs or try to do something with Ringside Medicine are trying to monetize it somehow, and then you start getting into some sort of hairy area sometimes where you're doing more self promotion than you really are trying to forward the safety of the sport. So I've kind of shied away from that. But as stuff comes up and there's interest, in a particular area or something like that, I'm happy to write things for either the Underground or especially over at the MMA community and stuff like that.
Yeah, if you want to jump on here and have a conversation, we'd be happy to have you back.
Before we let you go, though, I want to point out that not only do you do this stuff, you said you do pro bono work, and I think you've told me that you just do it because you want to make sure there's a good doctor on site, and somebody to take care of the fighters, and that's honorable work, especially in such a violent sport. But you're also a big fan of the sport. I met you the first time you were going out to watch Wonder Boy fight in New York.
Yep.
I've run into you in Vegas, also supporting Steven. Obviously you're a fan of Steven and a friend of his. How about some other fighters that you've over the years kind of latched onto, or somebody you'd consider can't miss that you watch fight every time that you can?
Yeah, so there's a couple of people locally who I really like to watch. One of them you may have seen. He was on the Contender Series. Carl Reed, or John Reed, he goes by Carl most of the time. Who's one of our wrestling coaches. He's got a great wrestling background. He's really athletic, super strong, and he's got the highest fight IQ I think of anybody who I've ever met. It's almost impossible for him to make bad decisions in the stress of the moment. So he's really, really exciting, and he's taken his wrestling work ethic and really applied it well to striking. So he's won a couple of his recent fights by pretty impressive knockouts, and I think that you're likely to see him pop up in the UFC or Bellator in the not too distant future. And largely because of his work ethic and his fight IQ. He's one of those guys, you get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and check Facebook or Instagram, and he's, swimming laps. And then at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he's hitting mitts with Ray. And then at night, he's grappling and striking and stuff. He's just constantly working and making big strides.
Did I meet him? Was he with you at UFC
Yes,
in
actually,
New York?
that's right. Yeah, he was the tall black guy who was sitting right next to me. That's Carl Reed. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I remember you kind of tapped me on the shoulder and go, keep an eye out for this guy. You were telling me about his wrestling and how he's really helping Steven. I think he was helping Steven train for Woodley.
Yep. Yeah.
If I remember correctly.
Yeah, he's become one of Steven's main training partners because he's a big dude. He's he probably walks around 220 plus, really strong, and he's in typical wrestler shape. He's just impossible to get that guy tired, and a real grinder. So Steven gets used to trying to fight him off when he's pushing up against the cage and getting back up off the ground with him on. It's been a huge boon for Steven because Chris is fantastic, but he lives in New Jersey, so you can't be with him 24/7. So when Steven goes up there, a lot of times Carl will go with him, and those guys together that's a great camp.
Any other big name guys or old school fighters that you just kind of became a fan of over the years?
Yeah, I've always been a Chuck Liddell fan. I'm sort of skeptical of anybody who isn't a Chuck Liddell fan. I mean, he's just sort of, I think, kind of what MMA is all about. And on the same sort of page, Randy Couture, just some of the guys, when I really got into the UFC, watching it live and watching the pay-per-views, those were kind of their heyday. Used to love watching them fight. Same thing with Lyoto Machida and Anderson Silva for the same reason. I love watching those guys fight. And I'm a big Mighty Mouse fan. I love watching that guy fight.
Yeah, me too.
He's one of the few guys I've never seen Mighty Mouse fight live, and I'm going to the event here in 2.5, 3 weeks now. So definitely looking forward to that. I've stated I'm not a huge fan of the smaller weight class, but he's definitely one of those guys I still consider a can't miss fighter to watch him fight. So
yeah, and I like watching guys go toe to toe and throw, but I'm also a lot of the fights that you'll hear people complaining about online that are boring, that end up being a tactical matchup, either two grapplers who are kind of trying to fight underhooks the entire time or get head control the entire time, or two strikers who are standing half an inch out of real striking range trying to find that opening and throw that correct feint to get the guy to go. I find those kind of chess matches really interesting as well.
Yeah, I'm with you on those.
It's been kind of a theme, and we've asked most of our guests, how do you see the Bellator heavyweight tournament wrapping up here with Sonnen Fedor and Bader Mitrione?
Yeah, that's a good question. My heart would love to see Fedor win that. I know that, you're not wearing the sweater of glorious victory at the moment, I think, but I know you're a huge Fedor fan, and like I said, my heart would love to see him win, but I think that both Mitrione and Sonnen have a really good chance at taking that. I'm really interested to see the next round of fights to see how that goes.
October 12th, I believe, is the next one.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Out this way in Mohegan Sun.
Yeah, I'm curious to see where they put the Fedor fight. If they do a big weekend, I think that would be the smartest way for Bellator and really just promote the heck out of that weekend. I don't think off the top of my head the UFC has anything. Yeah, the UFC scheduled for the 6th, so they'd have that whole weekend to themselves if they do a back-to-back event and really promote it. So, well, cool, Jon. It's been great talking to you. Like I said, you've been really supportive of this show since day one, and just been cool when we've had a chance to run into each other, whether it's in Vegas or in New York. So do you have any sponsors, I don't know if you have anybody that helps you with your medical stuff, or if you just want to throw out where anybody can follow you or give your handle for the MMAcommunity.com.
Yeah, so all my social media stuff online is all under the @SCMMAMD moniker. I use that on the MMA community. I use that over at the Underground, and then on Twitter, most active at the Underground, or at the MMA community is where I do probably 99% of my posting.
Well, you gotta start using Twitter, man.
Yep. And if anybody has any specific questions about something, or an area they want to hear about, or if they, like you guys have a question about something that's coming up, or you want me to talk about something in particular, medical related, or when you start seeing more and more athletic commissions adopting the 10-point plan, or when hopefully after the ABC committee meeting or commission conference that's going on at the end of the month down in Orlando. Hopefully you're going to see some changes to the way boxers are doing their weigh-ins and weight classes. If that starts spreading over to MMA, I'll be happy to come talk about that. Or you can shoot me a message either on the MMA community or on Twitter, and I'll be happy to either come back on and talk to y'all or answer whoever's question.
Cool. Just so folks know, we're on Spotify now, so the audio version will be on Spotify, iTunes, Radio Public, Breaker. I forget where else I think we're everywhere now. So
yeah, I think we broke through. So yeah, and everybody can follow us at Combat Hour on Twitter. Myself at MMA Hawk 21 on Twitter and Instagram, and you can follow Ed at Carbazal on Twitter. Ed, before we started the show, you had mentioned you did an interview earlier today that you're going to add to the end of this episode for the audio version.
Yes.
You want to speak on that?
Yes, for subscribers, audio subscribers, bonus interview for you after this. Erin Blanchfield, she's 1-0 in MMA. She's making her Invicta FC debut at Invicta FC 30, July 21st. She's fighting I forget the name of her opponent. Her opponent's making her MMA debut, but Erin Blanchfield, she's EBI flyweight champ. She competed at EBI 12, and now she's fighting. She fought in CFFC. Now she's fighting in Invicta this month. So look for that. There'll be an article on My MMA News, and the audio for that will be at the end of this for anyone that subscribes to the audio stuff.
All right. Well, I look forward to hearing that and our show next week. So thanks again, Jon, for joining us. Good talk, and we look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Great. Thanks for having me.
See ya.
Take it easy, Ed.